We're finishing up on chapter 5, which was I mean, we spent 5 weeks on that. It was a difficult chapter, a lot of, theological development, mostly around the person of Christ and Jesus' connection with the Father. Homoousios, you might remember that of the same substance, but of a different person, one with the Father, true light from true light. We talk about the Nicene Creed, but in 451 of the Common Era, as if the Nicene Creed in 325 were not explicit enough. The Council of Chalcedon met and they came up with the Chalcedonian Creed, which further elaborated and in granular detail defined the relationship between Jesus and God the Father. And I mentioned this concluding chapter last time, and the image that I think is symbolic that Fredrickson wanted us to see of Jesus. Uh, this is in a baptistry, by the way, in Ravenna, Italy. Jesus dressed as a Roman soldier with the book open to, I am the way and I am the life, vita, veritas vita, ego sum via, and I am the life. Uh, but clearly, the church and the empire had become uh, one in many ways. There would be, conflicts. The question remains, how much power did the church have in the empire, and there would, be tests of that power for the ensuing centuries. But after Nicaea, and especially after Chalcedon, there is a very clear association between the church and Rome, or I should say Constantinople, the Roman Empire. So that's where we were last time. Any thoughts about that before we move on to this new chapter?
Oh, Dan,
Yeah, go ahead.
chapter 5, it seems to me, was a marvelous statement about patronage politics. And it reminds me of, Chicago in its heyday and New York and Boston, James Patrick Curley and the uh, the bishops dispensing all of their largesse right on down the line.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. Patronage politics. I always get mixed up. Patronage, to patronize, two different things. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a clear connection going on here, and the theology serves as a means of organizing the empire. And if you're on the outside of that theology, of course, the theology is always, is a moving target. But if you're on the outside of that, pagans didn't really fare too terribly poorly, but Jews and unorthodox Christians certainly did. And it's no uh, coincidence that at this time, somewhere about this time period in Egypt, there were a number of texts that were hidden off in the desert at a place called Nag Hammadi that we call Nag Hammadi, and they were known as the Gnostic Gospels, and they were all Gospels as well as texts that you know tended to lean more towards, well, not tended, they leaned towards the Gnostic understanding of Jesus. And this is going to be a thread that runs throughout Christianity, that Jesus isn't one whose crucifixion is redemptive as much as the secret knowledge that he brings to people. And there will be many on the outside who will continue to maintain that understanding of Jesus. There is some of it, even in the mystical tradition, that we find in the so-called Orthodox, kind of an undercurrent of Orthodox Christianity, this understanding that, God, one can reach uh, perfect unity with God through the right disciplines and then ascetic and spiritual practices. Which brings us to this chapter, chapter 6, the redemption of the flesh. And I mentioned last time one thing that happened in church 2 Sundays ago with that I think Rose Kep is really good at, as an elementary school teacher. She knows how to incorporate what they might call the kinesthetic aspects into her teaching. She always has children, doing, hand motions and things like that. And I think it's really, in a very, very subtle way, it's really, really important what she's doing, because the affirmation of the body as a vessel um, of devotion to God, whether in prayer or whether in our daily lives, is something that has been rather weak in the Christian tradition. And this question, the 21st century question on, what is the role of the body and the redemption of the flesh in Christianity, is really an outgrowth of some very important, um, very important traditions that are starting to develop in the second and the third century. And I just want to reread, this introduction that Paula Fredriksen has to her book, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the philosophical background of, what's informing Christians and their understanding of the body. So I read it last time, but I'll do it again here. Ascetic practices had roots in both pagan and Jewish cultures, but over the course of the second through the fifth centuries, Christianity developed these practices in new ways. Voluntary poverty, fasting, and especially sexual renunciation became premier expressions of Christian spirituality. The value of marriage was heatedly debated, while sensational acts of self-denial commanded attention, admiration, and respect. This promotion of the ideal of virginity and celibacy put the question: what was the relation of the body to the self? And what was the role of the body in final redemption? Now, what's going to happen, just in a general way, over the next 5 centuries? There are going to be people who are taken by some words in the gospel regarding celibacy and remaining chaste, not marrying, and things along those lines, who are going to start forming their own communities. And these communities, especially by the third and the fourth century, are going to create alternatives to the, let's call it, orthodox, or the more traditional church, if you can even use that word at this time. But they're going to provide alternatives. And pretty soon, the power dynamic between, these wandering ascetic groups and the staid, established bishops in the urban centers was going to create opportunities, I'd say, but it's certainly going to create power rifts. But it was going to create opportunities also for the theological question to be raised about, what is the role of some of these ascetic practices? In the early, decades of the church, it was a different type of question, because remember, Paul, especially Paul and Jesus, were preaching about an imminent coming of the kingdom of God. But even prior to that time, there are what Fredriksen calls ascetic preludes. And so, just in a very general way, let's kind of set the paradigm, the glasses by which people interpreted their world. And it involves Greco-Roman philosophy. It also involves some, influence from Persian philosophy, Zoroastrianism, as well as Jewish ideas, as well as, some pagan ideas as well. So what are some of the ascetic preludes? Well, we have talked about in the past the dichotomy that we see in Platonism, where this world of change is imperfect, and an imperfect reflection of a world of, perfection that does not change, absolute perfection in the realm of forms or ideas. So there's a kind of suspicion of this world as not being able to give us a true understanding of reality itself. So the true scholar is one who contemplates the realm beyond, contemplates the abstract world that does not change. So if you wanted to be this is the ironic thing, if you wanted to be uh, uh, an expert in the study of trees, for example, it would not require anything about going out into the world and looking at various trees and their differences and how why some have leaves that are variegated and others do not. Some grow in a very straight line, and it had nothing to do with that. It would take Aristotle to really change that whole focus that, hey, we have to really actually get out and look at the concrete things. But if for a Platonist, it was about getting out and thinking about the idea of trees. You could do it just as easily in the middle of Athens with no trees in sight, because what you're doing is focusing on an abstract principle. So already by the 5th and 4th century BCE, we have a tendency in the Greek and then later the Roman world to think beyond this world. This world was a place that is either highly suspect in Platonism, as in its imperfection. But if you want to add to that the Persian idea of Zoroastrianism, this world comes to be a realm that is battling against uh, the light of truth. This is a realm of darkness, and that is certainly going to give its influence to our understanding of this material world. Um, the Stoics and the Cynics had a similar view, that the realm of change, even though guided by the logos, the the logic of the universe, was this realm was one that certainly tempted one away from the path to truth. And in Judaism, and we know this, I won't spend much time on it, of course, but there is in Judaism, in Egypt, according to Philo of Alexandria, we know him, who was a contemporary of Jesus, writing about Jewish traditions, uh, apocalyptic traditions like the Therapeutae and the Essenes. These were people who went into the desert and they, swore themselves against marriage. They would fast, they would pray. They were supported by a kind of a secondary community of people who would, bring them food and support them financially in whatever ways. But the idea was one of removal from this world, one that, tried to establish a new standard apart from, the chaos that happens in that crazy Jerusalem or Alexandria or wherever. And it would be this tradition that it's really important for us to remember that would most likely influence the later tradition of monasticism in Christianity that starts to develop around the 4th century, late 3rd, early 4th century. Um, and following the same model, uh, these men were not married. There were no women in the Essene community, at least not monastics. And they basically were waiting for the end of the world to come, right? When a new Messiah would come, a new messianic priest and a new messianic king, and a new world would begin. So there's a great there's a great mix of of otherworldly, uh, heaven or abstract, conceptually affirming ideas about, how to rise to truth and to reality. And, in this current century, many have suggested, and by the middle of the 20th century, that this is ultimately the paradigm at its core that is responsible for our ecological crisis. That our consumption, even though it's a very materialistic thing, we tend to think that we don't need to respect this world because it's a world that is not as valuable as our spiritual needs. So, all right, so let me stop right there. And Will, I know you're very keyed into that because we've talked about it so many times. So, any comments about what's happening in the first couple of centuries, Judaism uh, and Roman philosophy and Greco-Roman philosophy? By the time we get to the Bible, of course, I should say, by the time we get to the New Testament, we see indications of still this kind of ascetic orientation. We know that John the Baptist possibly associated with the Essene community, but we don't have any real evidence of that. But we do know that he is a person who is practicing these ascetic practices of denying the world, living in the desert, eating, locusts and honey, dressed in camel hair shirts and preaching the end of the world coming and the need for there to be a complete metanoia, a conversion, a turnaround, so that you're not on the wrong side of history when the Messiah does come. Uh, Followers of Jesus would later claim that John the Baptist was the harbinger of the Messiah, Jesus himself. And there is much about Jesus' ministry that seems to reflect a kind of an ascetic lifestyle as well. At least the tradition says that Jesus was not married all the way to his 30th year or so. He lived a very simple lifestyle, itinerantly with his disciples, uh, not looking towards the morrow, as he's often quoted as saying, um, and concerned about the things of the spirit. But even before Jesus comes onto the scene, we have indications that the Apostle Paul, who believed himself to be called by Jesus to be the apostle to the Gentiles, that the Apostle Paul is carrying out this apocalyptic tradition. Jesus, the Messiah, is coming soon. Paul's conversion was such that he, whatever mystical experience he had, he was convinced that the time was short and the days were approaching. And that being the case, we needed to get, as we say, our house in order. We needed to prioritize, what our values were. And it's in this context that he writes the letter to the Corinthians. And I think it's kind of interesting to read, especially given our current uh, focus in some evangelical circles on, the need for people to go get married and start having children and going to get $1,000 per child now, this year at least, to really try to push the marriage and uh, matrimony and producing children idea. Paul wanted nothing of that. We know that Paul himself was unmarried. He, we don't know what his life was beforehand, but it does not appear that he had a wife. There's no indication of that. So he himself may have been a Jewish ascetic of some sort. But in Corinth, this crazy church that was probably the most diverse in our language, the most woke church of 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 the fifth decade, the sixth decade of the early church. You know, Paul was writing letters to them, trying to give them an indication of how they should act. How should we organize ourselves? How should we pray? What should be the rituals of the church? And more than that, what about all these widows who are coming to us? And what is the role that they play in the church, right? We know in Judaism there was always a focus on widows and orphans, and it's being perpetuated and carried out in Christianity. But Paul gives his own little reflection on marriage and whether to be married or not. And starting in First Corinthians chapter 7, and it's funny, when we go to weddings, we always hear the marriage affirmations from Ephesians and Colossians, wives be subject to your husbands and things like that. And what Fredrickson does in this chapter is gives us a really good lead up to the context in which those later Pauline letters in First Timothy, for example, and Second Timothy, she gives us a lead up to the context in which those letters would be written in the name of Paul, so-called Deutero-Pauline letters. But this one is an authentic letter. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. Okay, something about this fleshly temptation, right? But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Now, what are we saying here, right? Marriage is you kind of the stopgap measure of making sure that you just don't burn in your loins with lust. It's a practical thing to ensure that your sexuality has remained in check, but nothing about Adam and Eve and man shall leave his family and a woman shall leave her home. uh, Nothing about that. Like, if you're going to burn in your loins, get married. um, the husband should give to his wife, let me see. Yeah, each man should have his wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. I mean, look how bodily oriented this whole idea of marriage is, right? Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourself to prayers and then to come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it's better to marry than to be aflame with passion. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, that the husband should not divorce his wife, and on and on and on. But it's not exactly a very hearty affirmation of the sanctity of marriage. Marriage is something that's going to keep you from overly sinning, you know. But if you really want to follow Paul's example, remain celibate and await the day of the Lord. That seems to be, a fairly common understanding in Paul's authentic letters. So by the 10th century, we know that Paul in his letters is, professing this idea. So let me stop and see if there are any questions from you married folks. Did you have this in mind when you chose your spouse? Oh boy, I better get married because, my hormones are driving me crazy. I mean, it's almost ridiculous to think of, right?
Dan,
Yeah,
isn't it true that part of the reason relates to your theory of apocalyptic Jesus, the Bart Ehrman view that when the world is going to come to an end and be wrapped up and we will all be changed, blah, 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 there's no reason to spend time worrying about these things. So
right.
that's why you have you have Jesus in one of the gospels prohibiting divorce. And then
Yeah,
then in another gospel, I think he prohibits it except for adultery,
right.
if I have that right.
Yeah,
Um,
Mark and Matthew.
yeah, and because there was just no reason to worry about regulations, because there's not going to be anyone on this earth to regulate. And then it seems to me that by the
Mac, you're
and of course
frozen.
Paul was before the
Oh.
Gospels. It's Fredrickson's talking about, enough time had gone by that people had to deal with those issues, and then they started drawing on inspirations from other cultures, like you say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Is exactly what's going on. By the end of the first century, you know, these other traditions start to infiltrate,
But,
especially.
and we
Go
still
ahead.
have it as we still have that as uh, evidenced by Catholic priests not getting married, nuns not getting married, no
Yeah.
female priests.
Right,
Um,
right,
and in fact, in the Catholic Church, theoretically, no divorce.
right, right.
And it's still,
Right.
this is 21st century stuff now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Uh,
Now, interestingly enough, you all know, I'm sure, that the Greek Orthodox priests do marry. They can marry. They did not see this as, they had a much more body affirming understanding of of redemption. That redemption was something that included both body and soul, and the body was not, it's the Platonic uh, or Plato's notion of, the human being is like a chariot driver. You've got the soul and you've got the body and you've got reason that's trying to keep, the two on the road together because body fights against soul. Well, in the Greek Orthodox tradition, and we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there is more of a creation affirming idea that all of creation is redeemed and all of creation contains the and benefits from the presence of the Holy Spirit. Uh, it's not just keeping your horse bridled while your soul ascends to the heavens. But Mac, you mentioned that the Matthew passage because I'm going historically here. By the time we get to the Gospel of Matthew, written around 85 or so, you've got these similar words being spoken by Jesus in Matthew chapter 19. And this is the context where people come to him and say, well, uh, tell us who's going to be married to who. If a man divorces his wife, and she remarries, or if a brother dies and he marries his brother's wife and he dies on down the line, who's she married to in the coming kingdom? So here's Jesus teaching about divorce. It's on chapter 19, and the place where Fredrickson focuses is on the 12th verse here, but I'll read the whole thing because we just hardly ever get to read scripture that much. So when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. By the way, that's John the Baptist territory, right? Large crowds followed him, and he cured them there. Some Pharisees came to him, and to test him, they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" And he answered, "Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." That amounts to a prohibition of divorce, right? They said to him, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" And here's the foundation of some supersessionism, right? That now there's a new law, and the old law has passed away. Why did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her? And he said to them, "It was because you were so hard-headed that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another commits adultery. His disciples said to him, and here's where Fredrickson focused. His disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs that have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. So there are people who are just naturally independent, maybe we call them asexual today. There are people who are made eunuchs, tragically, at least at this time. But there are also people who choose the life of a eunuch according to Jesus. And to do so for the kingdom of God is to follow the so-called higher path. And so whether this tradition is original to Jesus, we don't know, because this, I'm pretty sure, let me check my notes here. I don't think this tradition about the eunuchs, I'm sorry, I should have checked this beforehand, but I think this is a unique tradition, the discussion about eunuchs in the Gospel of Matthew only. So there is something about the Jewish Christian community to which Matthew was writing that called forth this teaching from Jesus. But it seems very similar to what we've seen from Paul. So the question becomes, since Paul precedes us by about 35 years, are we seeing Paul's theology being placed in the mouth of Jesus? So any other comments about this?
Dan,
Yeah.
back to celibacy for a second. Several years ago, Carol and I were part of a sort of a seminar in our church in Green Valley, Arizona. And John Dominic Crossan was the invited speaker twice. And the first time he introduced himself, and he just paused, with that impish John Dominic Crossan wry smile. And he said, and I want to tell you as a retired monk that celibacy is vastly overrated. And the people there just appreciated that line so much.
Yeah, I bet so. Yeah, and I think he's mentioned that several times, and of course in his perfect, little Irish accent, and just, yeah, impish is the right word. Yeah, vastly overrated. But it's interesting, isn't it? We have to ask the question in light of James Dobson's, recent death, where did all this family values stuff come from? We've got a guy named Jesus who said, you must be willing to leave your family. And you've got a guy named Paul who apparently didn't have any family and wasn't really hyped up on going out and making one, right? And you have a number of people in the historical context that we're talking about who appear to believe that to truly follow the path of truth and enlightenment, if you will, you must not focus on any of your bodily desires, which include your commitment to marriage. So then, how did we get to this place where we get a guy in Colorado Springs, Colorado, who's making millions and millions and creating culture wars around this idea of, the Christian thing to do is to, engender these family values? Well, this is the question that Fredrickson is really posing in this chapter, and her transition sentence. I'm now a writing coach, and I'm focusing on the importance of transition sentences. But this is a good one. All of that historical background on the Therapeutae and the Essenes and Plato, not as important as what happens after Paul in the Gospels. And so this is from page 148. Apocalyptic expectations informed Jewish ascetic teachings preserved in Paul's letters and in the Gospels. So it makes sense that you don't want to focus on marriage if you're expecting the Messiah to come very soon. We can understand that. But in the second century, these teachings shifted from ways to prepare for the kingdom's imminent arrival to timeless standalone dicta authorized by their evolving status as Christian scripture. So now, instead of efficient measures to keep people focused on the kingdom, now they're taking on the character of what we might call Platonic ideas or forms. These are timeless, absolute dicta. Various enactments interpreted the meaning of this heritage in changed circumstances, as the question of how to treat the body immediately impacted the issue of how to redeem the body, or rather, what the issue of redemption itself meant. The result was a period of centuries-long experimentation, both individual and communal, in how to live a Christian life, and thus how to win eternal life. We still got to live, right? And much of our living, and I'm being facetious here, involves our day-to-day bodily tasks, right? What role does the body play in this? And there will be various interpretations of this. But the next section of the book, as she entitles The Ascetic Laboratory, and I have to admit, I'm fascinated by this, roughly from about 100 of the Common Era up to about 500 of the Common Era, and the development of what comes to be known as the monastic tradition, and some of the some of the ascetic practices that these monastics, especially in the desert, would put themselves through. You may know a little bit about Saint Anthony, and we'll talk about him. But there is one group, especially in the early centuries of the church, that has some staying power up to the point where they are just kind of pushed out by orthodox statements, creedal statements of what it means to worship Jesus. But it is the group led by the man named Marcion. Marcion is the person who, very much like the Gnostics, believed that Jesus was a person who came not to redeem flesh as much as to instill in his believers a kind of secret knowledge. And redemption meant holding on, being part of that knowledge, which meant being part of the Marcionite community. So for Marcion, redemption did not have anything to do with the flesh being saved. In very Manichaean slash Zoroastrian fashion, the idea that the flesh was evil was certainly part of this theology. Not only that, but you had this understanding that if you want to look towards a people who are dictated by the desires of the flesh, you just simply look at the Old Testament. I mean, why was there a law in the first place? Is because people couldn't control themselves, So God has to put these laws in place. But now with the coming of Christ, not only have these laws become irrelevant, but now Judaism itself can be exposed as a completely degenerate religion, not even created by the Creator God himself, but by a version of Plato's demiurge. So Christ as a revealer becomes an important part of a movement in the first couple of centuries of the church, second to third century of the church, um, that garners a lot of support, a lot of followers, right? And it was because of this a heresy came about, something called Docetism, from the Greek word dokeo, meaning to seem or to appear. And Docetism was the idea that Jesus really didn't even have a human body. He was not a fleshly person himself at all. He just appeared to be that way. And so people will say, well, what about him being on the cross? He obviously suffered on the cross, and Marcion's answer would be, no, he just appeared to suffer. By that time, his spirit had left, the body altogether. And well, there are versions of this, but he only appeared to suffer on the cross. And so the focus is for Marcion on this God of love who wants to draw people back to him in this, realm of truth. And Tertullian's response is that, if you're just going to focus on this God of love, well, then what incentive do you have to be ethical? If God's always going to forgive you and everything, you need to have some fear of God, right? So here's Tertullian, wanting to promote the idea that that laws that were put in place in the Old Testament were there to give people some guidelines, but also to instill a sense of the fear of God in them. Probably not the best way to run a religion. So you can see how Marcion's perspective was pretty attractive, right? You can pawn off any transgression that you have on the fact that your body made you do it, and your spirit is not in control completely of your body. It lives in a realm apart from this. So it doesn't matter what kind of sinning you do down here, all of it's going to pass away, and you will live as a spiritual being. That's kind of attractive, right? Because you can pursue truth, but also you can have your cake and eat it too. Let's put it that way. Any thoughts about that? This is classic Gnosticism, and there are a variety of Gnostic movements, but this is, probably the most prominent in the second and third century. You can see how it would appeal to people. Frederickson also mentions, just very briefly, Justin Martyr, who wrote in the middle of the second century. And he's got these strange places in his apologies, his apologia, where I'll just mention this one where he actually holds up as an example a man who wants to castrate himself. This is true spiritual wisdom. In fact, let me just read it. I can't remember what page that's on. Justin, in his second apology, mid-second century, approvingly spoke of a woman who, without her husband's consent, decided to live a life of continence. Paul had enjoined mutual consent, right? So in other words, this woman said, hey, I'm out of here. We're not doing it for a time period and by mutual consent. Now Justin is saying, the marriage contract and what Paul was promoting, that's out the window. This is good behavior on the part of Justin. And in his first apology, here's the funny thing. He reported, again approvingly, that a young man in Alexandria had recently petitioned the Roman governor for permission to be castrated by a physician. this enthusiast took literally Jesus' clarion to those who would make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Origen, later Christians accused, had himself interpreted this verse in Matthew literally. So there were, Jesus, who was metaphorically, hopefully he was metaphorically speaking. Now that the Gospel of Matthew comes to be read a little bit more generally, people are taking Jesus' words literally and saying, if I truly want to be a follower of Christ, I must be a eunuch. I try to be faithful to my religious convictions, but I got to tell you, I wouldn't go that far. I'm not interested in that form of self-mutilation. But you can see the direction that we're going, and it's going to get even more interesting. I don't want to say worse. It's going to get more extreme as we move towards the Desert Fathers. But the one place where I'm glad Fredrickson spent some time on this, because I've never read this book, and it's available, but it's one that certainly has a prominent place in the early traditions of the church, beginning about the second century, around 180 of the Common Era. And it's the story of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. It's a novel, really. It's the idea. It is the story of a woman, uh, Thecla, who is a noble woman. She's engaged to be married to a band. I think his name's Thamyris, and she happens to hear one day. She's in her house, and she happens to hear one day Paul preaching outside her window. She doesn't see him, she just hears him. So there's no possibility that she is in any way sexually attracted to Paul. She is attracted to his message. And Paul is preaching a form of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the virgins. This isn't straight out of the Gospels, but basically he's trying to impress upon people the importance of these kinds of ascetic practices. And immediately Thecla decides, I'm taken by the spirit of this man's message. I'm going to call off the wedding. And she does. She calls off the wedding. And by this time, Paul is gone, and she spends, the next year or so of her life trying to track down Paul. But she is also starting to collect a cult of followers. People, because she's passing on the message as well. She's telling her story. And, and this cult of Thecla is going to persist all the way into, the fourth and fifth centuries of wandering ascetics, people who were, committed to these ascetic principles of poverty, chastity, and obedience would come later, but certainly poverty and chastity are their ideals. Now, interestingly, Tertullian objected to this story of Thecla, but only on one condition, and that is only on one principle, and that is that women shouldn't be preaching. Thecla was breaking the law of not being compliant with Paul's direction that women should not be leaders in the church. But the important thing here is that these wandering ascetics, going from town to town, start to pose a threat to the established church. So it makes sense that, bishops like Tertullian and Justin and others would oppose this type of activity, because these folks are basically, libertarian, you might say. Their primary commitment is to their ascetic values, not to the values established in the emerging creeds and orthodoxy of the church. So a conflict is starting to brew a little bit. So any comments about Thecla? Has anyone read it? It's not an uncommon book. I think that's going to be my next read after I finished. I'm reading some other things now, but I've heard it. I've talked about it so many times, and I should probably never talk about it unless I've actually read the book. But it's one of those early texts that's not, obviously not authoritative in any way, but certainly has persisted in the life of the church. So much so that by the 5th century, the 4th and 5th century, you've got people in Iconium or in present day Turkey that were regarding Thecla as as a saint. Saint Thecla still recognized today. So these ascetic alternatives start to create some problems. And we can already begin to see the problems they're creating. And this is why I love this chapter so much, because Fredrickson really puts the authentic letters of Paul and the Deutero-Pauline letters in stark relief. Remember what we just read from 1 Corinthians 7. Those letters were saying that people should not marry, right? Boy, do not marry. But by the time we get to the beginning of the 2nd century, when letters like 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy are being written, what are they espousing? No pun intended, but the importance of marriage. Now, if you're going to be a bishop, you must be married to one woman, right? And not only that, there must be some order in the household where the man is the head of the household, as Christ is the head of the church. And we see this in Ephesians, we see it in Colossians and 2 Timothy, but also in Timothy, we get these warnings about false teachers. These are folks who are just kind of wandering around, and they're coming into the church and they're trying to spread their message, but beware, they're false teachers. So you can see on the one hand, you've got the so-called Orthodox, staid, traditional, if we can even say that, traditional church being threatened by these wandering ascetics who are preaching their message and obviously coming to churches and feeling like they should be welcome there, right? But now you have rules in place as to how they should be accepted and how you should discern their authority and their message. And the kind of the standing principle was if they came to the church and stayed for more than 3 days, they were false teachers. So you didn't want them, setting up shop in your church. We see this also in this text called the Didache that we've talked about in the past as well. So we see in Paul, in the so-called letters of Paul, the authentic letters and then the Deutero-Pauline letters, which are probably written as late as the 2nd century, a historical indicator of this so-called all these ascetic alternatives that are starting to be part of the life and the the thinking of the church. I'd never thought of that before, but I think she's absolutely right about that. It's our time is pretty much upon us, but are there any comments about this? And I'd love to hear them.
Dan, if you have time, could you tell us a little bit about the illustration that of Michelangelo's Temptation of St. Anthony? The
Yeah.
the George Lucas characters who were attacking poor St. Anthony. Interesting.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's debated whether this is truly Michelangelo. but it is from an Italian school in the middle of the 15th century. But we haven't gotten to St. Anthony yet, but he's pretty much going to become a paragon of the type of ascetic life that is starting to develop in the second and the third centuries. And Anthony lived towards the end of the third century, and very much like John the Baptist, went off into the desert and tried to engage the so-called demons through his ascetic practices. And we know about Anthony from the life, a biography that was written by Athanasius. We've already talked about Athanasius, but Athanasius is holding him up as one who is basically trying to maintain these ascetic practices of lust, wanting to hold back his lust for women, wanting gluttony, the so-called seven deadly sins, right? And Anthony has, according to Athanasius, has all of this imagery about the demons coming to to try to take him from his course, his ascetic course. And so, yeah, I've always loved this image of Anthony in the desert. But you're right. It does look like the bar scene from Star Wars, doesn't it? You know, but the grotesquerie of the created of the world of matter, right? I mean, these are we can only call them grotesque, right? And later formed the models of the gargoyles on the medieval cathedrals. And so, but anyway, that's where we'll pick up next time, because we're starting to get into the beginning of this group of men and women that I find fascinating, called the Desert Fathers. So I'm getting a call, unfortunately. Excuse me. There. Anyway, Denny, were you going to say something?
I spotted Stephen Miller in that painting. Um,
Right here.
I think I did.
Yeah, yeah, not hard to miss, is he? So, okay, well, next time, we will continue in chapter 6, and we're about halfway through. We probably won't spend 5 sessions on this chapter. It goes much more quickly than our theology chapter. So, okay, well, I guess I will see you next time, and we'll continue with our reading. I do want to say that unfortunately, Damon has fallen way behind in posting these recordings, and for that reason, I think some of the people who have kind of joined us piecemeal here and there have not been coming because they can't catch up on the previous uh, our previous time together. So I'm going to try to get on top of that. Our last recorded session that's available on our website is April. So we've missed about 4 or 5 months.
Dan, is that anything you can do if you would be willing?
Oh, I'm willing, yeah. And I, now that I have a little time, I'm going to see.
Yeah.
But these recordings go to Damon's to Damon's uh, website, or to his email address. And so I'm gonna see if we can work it out, because I understand he's a busy guy. He's got a kid and everything, and he was on paternity leave. But I would like to have these made available, because if you look at the views on some of these recordings, some of them have 20, 25 views, which I find hard to believe. When people would want to sit through that. But anyway, I'll let you know how that goes, okay? So I'll talk to you soon, and Wednesday, that is, next Wednesday. See you later.